Purple Robe here, and welcome to the fifth and final chapter that I have up on YouTube of my novel The Shadow of Shub-Niggurath. I'll let you listen to it, so get started. My brother Errol and I are twins, Emma began. She and Tomas were now seated more comfortably on couches in the living room. She'd agreed to divulge her story to him in its entirety, and then he promised to let her know if it was possible for him to help her. He made it crystal clear that there were no guarantees in this direction. She only asked that he not interrupt, and though certain parts of her tale may seem far-fetched, to try to be open-minded and accept her account as true. This prerequisite in itself perked his interest, and he consented with a wry smirk. "We have a bond that twins sometimes have. I'm unable to explain it any more than that, but I've read that it's not uncommon. From a young age, I've had what I guess could be termed as visions about my brother. Now, I see that look on your face, and it's not like that. Normally, they're more in the line of premonitions. I sense things, and they tend to be accurate. Such as one time, I was waiting for Errol to meet me for lunch, and I had the vivid sensation that he was asleep, which was strange for midday. So instead of waiting at the restaurant, I took a cab to his house, and sure enough, he was napping on the couch. Again, little things like this are not abnormal among twins. However, sometimes my intuitions involve more of my senses, such as the time that I dreamt that Errol was being attacked by a girl with a pair of shears. I awoke in a fright, with the impression that he was horribly upset and needed comforting. However, I was not able to reach him until later that day, and when I did, he'd had the most dreadful haircut and was most distressed over it. Yes, you're laughing, but things like this have happened repeatedly to me over my lifetime. I've learned to take it all in stride, and I can say with the utmost assurance that these predictions, or whatever you'd like to call them, have never been wrong. Let me impress this upon you again when I say that I am never wrong. Errol joined the RAF when the war broke out, and he's turned out to be an excellent pilot. When the Nazis invaded in the summer of 1940, my brother was deployed to help protect the skies. I was in his shelter one day in August. I don't recall actually what day it was, but I was just having a bite of some canned beans and toast with some of the others hiding out, and had my first waking vision of Errol. It lasted maybe 10 seconds in all, but for that time, which felt like an eternity to me, I was in a plane over Birmingham. I was spinning around. The sensation was horrible, and then there was broken glass and wind and an awful pain in my right arm. The people I was with said they thought I was suffering a seizure or something, and I laughed it off, joking about the horrid taste of the beans. But I was quite sure that Errol had been shot. Still, the sensations I felt informed me that he was all right, or at least as all right as one can be in that situation. A few weeks later, after the end of the heaviest bombings, when we went back to our houses, I received a letter from my brother from the army hospital. In it, he related all the events about his wonderful dogfight, as he put it. He had been shot in the right arm, but he'd still been able to shoot down a Stuka before he'd been forced to land. He went on to explain how he'd almost fully recovered and was looking forward to flying bombing raids into Germany. Of course, by the time the note had come, I'd already known most of the information, especially that he was nearly recovered. Aside from the more normal feelings I had about Errol, I was now getting these rapid visions maybe 2 or 3 times a year. I'd really come to look forward to them, as for the most part they let me know that Errol was alive and well. Then, a few months ago, I had another one. It was longer, and not at all enjoyable. Emma was still fidgeting with her pocketbook, and she'd opened it as well as her cigarette case. She paused momentarily as she made to put a cigarette between her lips before remembering that she couldn't smoke in this particular apartment. She dropped her unfiltered woodbine back into its case, and Tomas noticed her hands were shaking. He also made out the English letters on the fag. She'd have to be warned about that sort of thing. Emma took a deep breath and continued. I was in my flat, just listening to the radio reports. It was something I've done a lot for the last few years, and I felt it again. I was in the air, in a plane. I don't know where or what was going on. At first I was happy. Only that first time in the bunker had a vision been a bad experience, and I was looking forward to a wing dip, or perhaps a sight of the Alps, or something nice to let me know that Errol was doing well before I turned in for the night. But suddenly I had such a fear in me, and it wasn't my emotion, but his. He was terrified, and it didn't take long to realize why. I did catch a glimpse of some mountains through the glass. In front of the peaks was another British plane, and without warning, it exploded into a blazing fireball. I could see the man, the pilot, screaming, trying to get out, but he was trapped, and the plane dove out of sight. I could sense that my brother knew this man, and there was a horrified sadness now mingling with the terror I felt. A nauseating sensation hit the pit of my stomach as the craft rose sharply. Then it was as if something slammed into my head, and I was back in my flat in London. And suddenly I felt nothing. Her eyes rose to meet Tomas. He held her gaze with a sympathetic one of his own, but all the while he was still wondering what it was she wanted from him. So, was her brother dead? What was she doing in Paris? Was she trying to get to Berlin to assassinate Hitler and end the war in the name of her brother? If so, he couldn't help. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He could think of absolutely nothing to say to her. Fortunately, she dropped her gaze and went on. I didn't know what to think. I'd never felt nothing before. You can imagine the conclusions I came to. In fact, I was fairly certain that he was, well... She turned her face away and stifled back tears, but then raised it with a look of determination, even triumph. But he wasn't. A few weeks later, I felt him again, and I knew he was alive, but hurting terribly. It was the next day that I envisioned him travelling at night, dirty and in pain, making his way towards Paris. Finally, that night I had a dream, one like I'd never had before. Previously, my feelings for Errol always occurred as they were happening to him. But that night, I dreamt that I was in Paris with him, nursing him, and that if I was not there, he would surely die. Yes, I can see that you don't believe me. Well, all I can say in my defense is that I was able to convince Mr. Cornish. He took great expense to get me here, and he promised me that you would help me to the best of your abilities. Apparently she was finished with her tale, but just to make sure, Tomas asked if that was all. It was not all. But if things sounded insane to this point, for Emma to tell the rest would bring the story to a point of lunacy that she dared not go with this American, who was clearly having doubts about aiding her despite her boss's assurances. Yes, that's all. She stood and turned away from him. Perhaps I should find a place to stay. Could you suggest an inn? This, as if she had taken a last-minute holiday without a care in the world. Tomas was silent for long enough that she spun back around to face him. Her eyes were wet, and any thought of carefreeness was quashed. Tomas, though, had steeled himself from the tears of women so many times that the sight of them now only had the effect of angering him. He found some paper and a pencil in a bureau, and began drawing a crude map for her of the city, which covered much of the 1st, 7th, and 8th arrondissements. He clearly marked where they were currently, as well as a few places she may be able to sleep if she had enough money, and indeed her pockets were well lined. Hammaker had supplied her sufficiently with francs and marks. Tomas gave her a few tips on who it may or may not be wise to speak with, how to hide her lack of French and German, as well as how to better make herself not stick out so much. She thanked him graciously and accepted his map. I suppose it would be silly of me to ask if you've heard anything of a downed Royal Air Force pilot coming into Paris lately? She wasn't good at being coy, though she did bat her eyelashes at him as she asked. Maybe it was her attempt at levity. No. Tomas never spoke much at the best of times, and he found no humor in her question. At present, he just wanted her out the door. He had enough to deal with, though he had the ability to be generous in his own right. He disliked feeling indebted or having to do something for any reason other than that he wanted to. Guilt was a nonsensical emotion to him. He would do what he could for Miss Grey, and mostly he would do it for Ham, but he wasn't likely to stick his neck out any further than it needed to see what was right in front of him. I'll ask around a bit, but I'll need to be discreet, so... Of course, I understand. She took a deep breath and continued, There is one more thing. His eyebrows lifted sharply, showing his irritation. The other name Mr. Cornish gave me was of... And here she dug into her purse again, and came out with a much-lined piece of parchment. Henry Brickhow. Her pronunciation was atrocious, but he knew of whom she spoke, and it made sense that Ham would know Henri, as they both dealt in foreign real estate. Henri. Burke-Bruchot, Tomas corrected. He put out his hand expectantly, and she returned the newly created map for him to make a last mark upon it. "Now I think you'd better go. People may begin to ask questions." He led her to the door and showed her out. "I wish you good luck, Miss Grey, and that you find your brother in one piece. Let me know where you're staying, and I'll get any information I come by to you as quickly as possible." Then he added, extremely reluctantly, "And if you need anything, just come and see me." Emma smiled warmly in return. She was a troubled young lady, and her problems weren't looking to end any time soon. When Tomas closed the door to his flat on her, he wondered if she had any idea just how impossible her mission was, and how severe was the danger to her person. From that troubled look in her eye, he guessed she probably had a fair clue. He opened his hand and looked at his palm. The double eagle was there in its center. He put it in his mouth and bit. Real gold, all right. He used his thumb to flip it, and then snatched it out of the air with practiced ease. He replaced it into his pocket, and then returned to his bar to tend to his business for the night. Emma Grey left La Poisson Hero, feeling no better than when she had arrived. She didn't think she'd made a very good impression on Mr. Beaujard, and wasn't sure that he'd be of any real use to her. What she needed right now was to find the house of Mr. Jardinier and get herself a room. Monsieur Beaujard said that regular inns were routinely checked by the Gestapo, so that they could keep tabs on anyone traveling through. A better bet was to stay at a private residence. The barman had marked a few on her map and told her the best chance she would have would be with Jardinier, who hated Germans, loved money, and rarely asked questions. She hadn't slept for more than a 3-hour stretch in a few weeks, and was hopeful to find a bed and catch up. Tomorrow she could begin her search for Errol in earnest. It had been an astounding month since she'd come to the realization she must get herself into Paris to find her brother. Before that, she ate, she slept, she listened to the radio a lot, she did her secretarial duties for Mr. Cornish. She listened with wariness for the air raid sirens. Basically, she survived in London like everyone else. After the sensations which told her that Errol had been shot down and was possibly dead, she was inconsolable. Mr. Cornish had sent her home a few times that week, as she was too distraught to perform her duties. She had been his personal assistant since before the war, and the two were as close as a wealthy businessman of minor royalty could be with a subordinate without it being untoward. Cornish thought of her as a little sister and was quite overprotective. He knew about her bond with Errol, and though he thought the supernatural aspect was complete rubbish, he humored her gently, and looked upon her closeness with her brother as endearing. Eventually she'd confided in him not only the premonition of her brother's possible death, but the vision of her need to be in Paris to save his life. Hammaker Cornish attempted every possible method to dissuade her from the thought of going to France to find Errol, but when she had come to work one morning telling him she'd booked passage on a frigate to Monte Carlo and intended to cross all of southern Europe on foot if she had to, he determined to take over the planning of her rescue attempt. He thought she was insane by this time and knew things could only end badly, but if he couldn't stop her, then he would do all he could by using his influence to help. He had never been very close with his own siblings, as she was with her twin, and in a way he was jealous of that reckless love. So he'd pull strings with an RAF pilot friend who flew bombing raids into Germany, but was laid up injured at home. At first his friend, Flight Lieutenant Gregory Donald, wanted no part of smuggling a young civilian girl into occupied France with nothing but a parachute. But Hammaker got him mighty drunk and promised him a knighthood after the war. Even so, when he'd sobered up, he was very uncomfortable with the idea. Once she was on the ground, and indeed, if she even survived the jump, she would be completely on her own. Gregory asked timidly if Miss Grey had any parachuting experience. Afterwards, he wished he hadn't. He explained to them that Britain had already dropped more than 400 operatives into occupied France this way, people he referred to as the Baker Street Irregulars, and he himself had flown a few of those missions with the number 299 Squadron. He'd even heard of a few female SOEs, but an untrained civilian? He didn't like it, and he made his position clear. Hammaker used every dirty trick in the book to talk him into it, from telling college secrets to his wife, to reiterating his promise for a knighthood, to threatening to kill him outright in a most undignified way. Gregory saw through these ploys instantly. He finally used the same way Emma had convinced him, which was proving with sincerity that Emma was going to go about this task one way or another, and if she was to have even the slightest opportunity, he must help. And so, Flight Lieutenant Donald was recruited to join their little covert action. The plan became fairly simple. Gregory, who was now fit enough to rejoin his squadron, was to be deployed in Caen. However, he could conceivably get lost long enough to end up somewhere near eastern France, say between Bayonne and Bordeaux, which, though technically occupied by the Germans, was not of sufficient importance to keep a terribly close eye on, especially since the D-Day attack at Normandy proved there was no pressing reason to cover the rest of the French Channel coast. Also, the Germans had only left skeleton crews in those areas, as the rest were sent as reinforcements to Normandy. If he flew under radar, he could make it. The whole flight from lift-off to touchdown in Caen would take him no more than 3 hours if he hurried. Of course, that was 2 hours longer than it was supposed to. He was going to have to fake a navigational error on a pretty straightforward flight. However, if they had poor weather, which was probable, there would be even less of a chance of being spotted, and would provide more of an excuse for being so far out of position. He could provide Miss Grey with the basics of parachuting knowledge, and see her out the bay door. Ham Cornish set Emma up with everything he could think of that might help her. He had papers forged for her in the name of Emily Simone, as well as official documents granting her a journey from Bordeaux to Paris to visit her ill father. He obtained a beautiful and large travel bag that could be slung over the shoulder for easy carrying. Along the inside seam of this piece of luggage was a secret compartment where something as large as an overstuffed wallet would fit. If it were ripped apart, it would be easily discovered, but the hiding spot would pass 99% of perfunctory inspections. Hammaker dipped into a private account of his, and filled her secret compartment with an array of marks and francs, as well as a few specifically selected gems for bartering. He'd even taken her shopping to get a suit of clothes more appropriate for Paris. She kept these in her travel bag, and it was her only change. She would wash as she went, to conserve space, as well as to keep things light in case she had to carry her belongings for a great distance. Aside from the forgeries, which took the longest and cost the most to acquire, things were prepared rather slapdash, as Flight Lieutenant Donald was to leave London in less than a week. Cornish and Donald devised a plan to get her onto an airfield, and she quickly boarded the Avro Lancaster. Ham handed Gregory a veritable diamond mine of pound notes to distribute amongst the 6 other crewmen who would be arriving shortly. Goodbyes were brief and terse, as Hammaker was forced to vacate the airfield quickly to avoid any undue questions. The extra flight suit Gregory had stolen for Emma naturally didn't fit, but he made her wear it anyways, and he strapped the parachute on her back before any of his crew arrived, telling her he wanted to make sure everything was done properly, and he wouldn't have a chance once they were airborne. He buckled her into a seat in the fuselage, and instructed her to speak as little as possible to his men. Flight, or her part of it, would be short, at under 2 hours. "Will you have any problem jumping from the plane when the time comes?" Gregory was very handsome in his uniform, and Emma, who had only ever been in a plane twice, was already beginning to feel nauseous. She smiled bravely. "I have no idea, Mr. Donald." He smiled back warmly and with the proper amount of concern. "Don't worry, Miss Grey. I'll make sure you leave the plane without a hitch. By the time you're in the air, all you'll have to do is pull your ripcord and protect yourself during the landing like I instructed you. I've checked your chute at least a dozen times already, but you must remember that as soon as you reach the ground, to remove my flight suit and my parachute and hide them as quickly as possible." She interrupted with that same wan smile. "Very good." He turned and called back over his shoulder. "You'll be fine." He waited for his crew outside the plane, and Emma had no idea what he had told them about her. When they finally came in, they hardly glanced at her as they made their way to their different posts. None of them were stationed near her, so when the plane took off, she found herself quite alone. Her nerves were really on end. All she could think about was the fact that she was going to have to jump out of a plane shortly. Thoughts of traveling through an enemy land with dangers accosting her literally at every minute didn't even creep into her mind. She didn't have to worry about parachuting for too long, for as they reached their maximum cruising height of 20,000 feet, she had a very peculiar experience. She was strapped into her flight chair, listening to the deep hum of the engines. The Avro was over the water and heading southerly when her vision went suddenly muddy, almost as if her face had been slammed into the wet earth of a bog. Emma could actually smell the putridness. She instinctively held her breath so as not to swallow the muck. Then those sensations were gone to be replaced with green seawater. She was in the depths of the ocean, terrified out of her wits, leagues down. She struggled against the great weight of the water pressing her down even further. She was suffocating, unable to breathe, flailing her arms in strokes she hoped would carry her up to the surface. And that is when she saw it. It was the only way her mind would rationalize the vision of horror beside her. It was something not even the deepest, darkest, most evil places of her imagination would ever have been able to create if it were turned insane and unleashed in anger. This Leviathan thing, this totally alien being, was almost close enough to touch her, and she was positive that if it did, if any hideous part of its rubbery form even brushed against any portion of her fully clothed body, she would lose her sanity forever. And this beast, this immense monster, was moving. It was rising, lifting itself with tremendous power upward. It was larger down below than it was at its top, though no one could tell one side from the other, except by the logic that its top was the closest part to the surface. As it rose, the displacement of the water pushed her outward like a rag doll, and she was lifted along with the Colossus toward the world above. There were tentacles coming out of areas of its frame from all angles. They squirmed and twisted, aiding in the emergence of this creature from its watery resting place. It was old. Emma could feel its age as a tangible thing wafting off of it with the sea froth. Age fell from it in an extraordinary way, age that could not be defined in human terms. Indeed, there was absolutely nothing human about it. But the most disturbing thing was its eyes. If you could call them eyes. They didn't particularly resemble any kinds of orbs Emma had ever seen before, but she got the feeling that it was watching her with them, and its gaze covered her soul in dread. At this point, she was sure her lungs must have burst, and that her death would be welcome if it took her away from this horror. Her brain was a puzzle of all the pictures of her life, and it felt as if pieces and even full pictures were being ripped out of her painfully, and those illustrations, now full of holes, were what remained of her sanity. She tried to close her eyes and realized with drooling lunacy that her eyes were closed, and she was still forced to witness the unhinging of her mind. And just like that, it was gone, and she was on dry land. She was filled with sadness, and she didn't know why. She opened her eyes. There in front of her lay a mutilated corpse, its flesh rent as if gnawed on. Was this her brother? Was this Errol? Is that why she was so consumed with grief? Whether it was or not, she wondered what could have done such damage to this person who had once been alive. Emma raised her sight to take in her surroundings. She was on a rain-swept beach. It was night-time, and despite the rain, there was a fire nearby. People ran by screaming and were cut down by machine-gun fire. She watched as a young girl's head exploded into fragments of skull and brain, splattering Emma's own shirt. Behind her was a huge wood structure that looked like a large pen of some sort. Smoke and soot passed by her face, and above her airplanes buzzed. One looked like the Lancaster that she was in even now. Others were smaller. One with a red swastika on its side was firing its guns into one with a red dot, surrounded by a thin white circle, surrounded again by a thick blue ring, and finally enclosed by a thin yellow circle. The bullet-riddled craft immediately took a nosedive as black smoke plumed from its tail. As she followed its trail down toward the earth, its progress was suddenly stopped. The terrifying monster from below the waters now blocked out the horizon. If it was possible, it was even larger than it had been. Some black and gray bubbling and blubbery portion of it whipped out like a hand, swatting a fly, and slapped the dying plane out of the air. The buzzing of the engine ended abruptly. The craft crumbled and fell like a pebble. There was something Emma was required to do, but she couldn't recall what it was. She searched her memory. It had to do with Errol. Where was Errol? She needed his help, but there was no sensation of his presence, only the intense anguish that filled her heart. Emma stood there, sure she could take no more of this gruesomeness. Then things got worse. The beast unleashed a noise like nothing on this earth had ever heard, its volume almost so loud as to render it inaudible, and her eardrums shattered with a snap. The force of the noise pressed her to the ground, and she fell in a dizzy swoon as the thing expressed its triumph. Emma opened her eyes as Flight Lieutenant Donald shook her shoulder. "It's time," he said, thinking in amazement that she had actually dozed off before this incredible journey she was about to begin. Emma glanced about the cabin, reorienting herself with reality. She couldn't recall most of what she had just seen in her mind's eye, and was highly grateful for that. She did remember her brother's dead body, and fixated her consciousness on it. No, she could still feel her brother. It was a weak sensation, the same as it had been since she'd reacquired it after he'd been shot down, but it was there. Errol was alive. But his future, and of course her own, was no longer clear to Emma. Would she find him in Paris and help nurse him back to health? Or would she arrive too late and discover his mutilated corpse on some beach? And what of the possibility of a German victory due to the fact that they had awakened some great evil from the depths of the sea? Was this the future she had glimpsed? Was it one of two possibilities? She shivered uncontrollably. A moment later, she was dropping like a lead weight, watching her last ties to security bank sharply and turn away from her. That was Chapter 5 of The Shadow of Shub-Niggurath. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to hear more than those 5 chapters, hit my Patreon page. It's got all my novels, short stories, poetry, all sorts of stuff. I know you'll like it. So thank you.